the IOHR and the ICFJ webinar. My name is TRISH LYNCH, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator today for this webinar entitled Infodemic, the Virus of Misinformation. Now, I know we have people joining us today from all over the world, so thank you, warm welcome, good to have you with us. And please do remember that you can be part of the conversation by submitting your questions to our experts, and we will do our best to get through as many of those questions as we possibly can. Okay, so just to set the scene, over the past few months, the coronavirus pandemic has absorbed all the energy from the news cycle, and in its place, fake news, misinformation, conspiracy theories, PR exercises, and propaganda machines are fueling the epidemic of misinformation surrounding COVID-19. The World Health Organization has declared an infodemic on incorrect information about the virus, which poses a severe threat to global health. So, how do we decipher fact from dangerous fiction? How do we get to the truth in these unprecedented times? Well, I'm delighted to welcome my expert panel today to help us unravel this complicated topic. I'd like to welcome Tom Phillips, who is editor of Full Fact, which is the UK independent fact-checking charity. They investigate the really big stories, the stories that have made a real impact on people's lives. They get to the bottom of them and they find out what the truth is. So that's Tom Phillips. I'd like to welcome Natalia Antelava. She is a journalist and a co-founder of Coda Story. A Coda Story puts a team of journalists on one crisis at a time. They stay with that story. They provide unique, in-depth continuity and understanding to events that shape the world. And her area of expertise is Russia and Russian disinformation. I'd like to welcome Rui Zhong, Program Associate for the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States, Wilson Center, and her area of expertise is China and Chinese disinformation. Dr. Julie Posetti, Global Director of Research, the International Center for Journalists, Research Associate at the Reuters Institute, Oxford University, and author of Protecting Journalism Sources in the Digital Age. And finally, I'd like to welcome Martin Schibbye, who is a Swedish journalist and editor-in-chief of Blankspot. And in 2012, he was sentenced to 11 years in prison while covering a story in a closed region of Ethiopia called the Ogaden region. He was pardoned after serving 14 months in prison, and he has written a book about his time behind bars. It's called 438 Days. So welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Now, Julie, I'd like to kick off with you, please, because there's a lot of confusion out there. Fake news has been called many different names. We have fake news, misinformation, disinformation, and a relatively new one, malinformation. Can you just clear it up and tell us what they all are?
Clear up the information pollution. I'll do my best. It's murky territory, really. So I think traditionally we've differentiated between misinformation and disinformation like this. Misinformation is incorrect, inaccurate information, often shared without malicious intention. So it could be information that you share about that cure you read in a WhatsApp post from a family friend, which is about gargling salt water as a cure for coronavirus, which we know is utterly false. Sharing that with the intention of trying to assist others dealing with this pandemic, for example. Disinformation is generally understood as false information that is deliberately peddled with malicious intent. And malinformation is a term that was coined first by the people at First Draft News in a report for the Council of Europe, which looks at the malicious creation of content that perhaps bridges those categories. But just for research that we have published, ICFJ and UNESCO, with my co-author, Professor Kalina Boncheva, on the flood of misinformation and disinformation that we're seeing swirling in connection with coronavirus, we're actually using the term a disinfodemic, because as much as the World Health Organization's categorization of this crisis as an infodemic, because we have this swirl of accurate public health information, credible journalism, and mis and disinformation, we're focused on what we're calling the disinfodemic, because the combination of disinformation and misinformation creates impacts that are far deadlier the consequences of this type of information, misinformation and disinformation, are so severe that we are using the term disinformation to categorize them relative to their impacts as distinct from the people behind the acts of mis and disinformation.
Thank you, Julie. There's some statistics have just come in this morning. Professor Phillips, our director of Oxford Internet Institute, gave his findings on parliamentary TV here in London, and some of the findings are quite incredible. He said 1 billion accounts receive misinformation. Misinformation is mainly in English, so it's targeting an English-speaking audience. And 25% of people on social media believe that the virus was created in a lab. And a staggering figure here, 59% of false Twitter accounts remain up because there's no consistent standard to take them down. So that gives us an idea of just how monumental this program is. And that brings me nicely to you, Tom. Tom, you're the editor of Full Fact. It's your job to get to the bottom of all these fake stories and tell us which ones are true and which ones clearly are not. Tell me, what are the biggest stories that are circulating around about the virus at the moment, how it began, so-called scams, cures, preventions? What are the biggest stories that are not true that are out there in the public domain?
Yeah, so we've seen a really wide range of stuff. So there's things about medical and health issues. There's things about sort of the governmental or social responses to the pandemic. There's things about the origins of the pandemic and things like that. So yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of misleading health claims, often which like have a kernel of truth somewhere buried in them, or at least they're based on a misunderstanding of something. And so, yes, you mentioned already the idea that gargling with salt water can do this, the idea that any sort of temperature above 27 degrees kills the virus, you know, which again is that sunlight will destroy the virus completely, which is a claim that's been circulating on Facebook for a long time, of course, has kind of moved into the political arena more recently, which of course are all based on things that have a degree of truth to them, but they're taken way beyond what the evidence actually can demonstrate. And, you know, the idea that a temperature of above 27 degrees centigrade kills the virus is kind of shown to be untrue by the fact that it's spreading in countries where the temperature is regularly higher than that. So that's one kind of thing that we've seen. We've also seen quite a few conspiracy theories around the origin of the virus, particularly in the UK, and I know in some other countries, a really big driver of this is 5G conspiracy theories. So the belief that the virus or the outbreak is somehow linked to the rollout of 5G telecoms technology. Worth saying that there isn't a single theory about that. There isn't like one conspiracy theory. There's a range of overlapping but often actually contradictory theories about that. You know, the virus is real, but 5G is making it worse. The illness is real, but it's not caused by the virus, it's caused by 5G, and there is no outbreak at all, and it's all a huge fake so that the government could install 5G under the cover of lockdown. So, you know, those are incompatible. They can't all be true, but they often get shared in the same groups. So those are major things that we've seen. You know, and then there's just a lot of stuff which is, again, in the territory of uncertainty, and it's claiming certainty where there is none. So, for example, whether or not, you know, pets can potentially spread the virus, which is an evolving area. You know, there's a possibility that cats might be able to contract it, but can then pass it back to humans. Genuinely, this is obviously a novel disease, and there's a lot that we still don't know about it. So that's another thing we're seeing a lot, is claiming certainty where there isn't any.
What's the craziest fake news story that you've seen?
So I was really taken with one that was sort of that the army was on the streets of South London to impose basically martial law, which turned out to be a picture of some students that was circulating. But it's the kind of thing that you see a lot of, quite understandably, you know, in a sort of a scary and confusing situation. It's not unreasonable that people's sort of natural defenses against misinformation may be a bit lower. You know, when everything is weird, then nothing is implausible. You know, so the idea that the army is out on the streets of Clapham and imposing martial law may not seem as weird as it normally would do. So yes, I mean, and there's a lot of stuff that we've seen. As I say, like the 5G conspiracy theories are really, really common. And as I say, they have gone to quite extreme lengths. As you know, there's people sort of turning up outside hospitals and sort of filming sort of the waiting area and going, "There's no one here," and saying like, "Therefore, this entire outbreak is a fiction." And it's like, well, no, it's you filmed that in the middle of the night, and also, yeah, the COVID patients aren't going to be in the waiting area. They're in the intensive care unit. It's not, it just doesn't. So, but, you know, it's really interesting when you sort of see people going to that kind of length of actually going, filming outside multiple hospitals in order to prove a point. I think it kind of shows how deep some of this goes.
Absolutely. And I was interested to what you said, that there has to be a semblance of truth. There has to be like an emotional hook to get people to believe it in the first place. Is that the key? There has to be something believable?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as I say, there needs to be a degree of plausibility, I think. I mean, you do see some things that are wild, but of course, like, everybody has a different standard for what they find plausible. And so, you know, some things that can feel very plausible to one person will be completely wild to another person, which of course is one of the areas where sort of that distinction between misinformation and disinformation can sort of, you know, sometimes break down. From our perspective, as I say, it's a valuable distinction to make. But from our perspective, when we're looking into like the central claim behind something, we often see that, something could start as disinformation, and then the same information can become misinformation because it's now being spread innocently, or can happen the other way around. You know, something can happen organically, but then can be picked up and amplified by more malign or like sort of politically motivated actors. But I think that is the thing, is that whether or not it happens organically or is in some way directed, there still does have to be this sort of emotional connection. And obviously in a public health crisis like this, the really strong emotional connection is something that feels like it maybe might protect, you know, your loved ones if you share it with them. So that's why I think there's such a strong driver of this kind of thing during a health crisis, because it's a really natural and understandable response. Is any piece of information that might help someone, you feel a really basic human urge to share that. Of course, the downside is that if it turns out to be wrong, it might do more harm than good.
Thank you for that, Tom. I'd just like to remind our audience who are watching, and I know there's quite a few of you, and you are from all over the world, so please do send your questions in for our speakers, and we'll do our absolute best to get to as many of them as we possibly can during this session. If we don't manage to get to them, we will make sure that they're published on our website, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. I'd like now to go to Natalia. Natalia, Tom touched on 5G and the conspiracy theory there, and I know that there is absolutely no fact linking those two, but there are a group of celebrities that are fueling this link between 5G and the virus, and between them they have a staggering 50 million followers. So when we look at something like this, I know this is a story that was published in Coda Story recently, what can be done when we look at 50 million followers and the influence that these people have? Once it's out there in the public domain, is there any way to turn back the clock on fake news, or is it simply too late?
Well, I think that's a question that we partially have an answer to, because we've seen how over the years, you know, fake news, obviously fake news is very old news, disinformation is very old news, but we've seen how proliferation of social media has kind of accelerated the spread and how much it has changed the society and created a real crisis. So we know that in some ways there is no way of going back. With the 5G, I think is a really good example of how these theories kind of get that foothold, because we did our first story on 5G about a few months ago. We reported it in sort of mid-2019, kind of looking at this very marginal groups. You know, we had a reporter in Switzerland talking to the guy who runs the anti-5G groups on Facebook, the international and other groups. And back then, Facebook was, as a platform, was completely uninterested in it, you know, did not sort of engage with us and were sort of not at all interested. And of course, what happens in general with these conspiracy theories is that, you know, once they're, you know, they pick up others. So the 5G groups will also be spreading the anti-vaxxer stuff and so on. There's a lot of sort of overlap. And then what happened is that as soon as the pandemic began, we saw these 5G groups go into an overdrive, an incredible growth among them, popping up everywhere. The Reuters Institute at Oxford University did a really interesting study recently where they looked at where they basically looked at the misinformation and looked at that the influential, I'm just looking over to get the number, basically still it was politicians, celebrities and influencers who are responsible for about just the fifth of misinformation online. But the engagement they get is about 70%. So they have a huge influence, which is why we went and, having looked at the politicians before around the world, we decided to go and look at the celebrities. And yeah, the calculations that we did between them, Wiz Khalifa and Kerry Hilson and Woody Harrelson is among the anti-5G campaigners, between them, it's about 50 million people who are highly engaged in this content. And then of course, they are you can call, I generally find coronavirus is very helpful in terms of, sort of understanding disinformation. Because they're the super spreaders, but then they're the local clusters as well, and then this kind of the virus, in this case the 5G, gets brought into a smaller group, smaller communities, and then spreads. And I also wanted to add something, sort of building up on what Tom was saying. You asked Tom about, what's the craziest piece of fake news that he's heard. One that stands out for me that I just saw a couple of days ago. You might remember 2012 Olympic Games in London. As part of the opening ceremony, they as a celebration of sort of great British institutions, they had NHS, like an event on NHS, and there were hospital beds rolled out and kind of dancing nurses and so on. And it was just part of the opening ceremony. A few days ago, a couple of groups in North Macedonia put out pictures of the London opening ceremony, saying that this is a proof that coronavirus is a Western invention. It was produced in the US labs, and the West even had a nerve to hint about it, to kind of announce that it was coming during the Olympic Games opening ceremony in 2012 in London. I mean, such a stretch, right? It just sounds so utterly crazy. But then what happens is that this complete piece of madness goes out online. Someone else picks it up, someone else, that kind of like the community spread begins. Lots of little clusters form. And eventually, and we've seen it again and again, it becomes normalized. More it spreads, more they pick it up. Suddenly we're saying some Russian big Facebook group quoting it, and then the website in Romania running it as a story, and it becomes normalized. It becomes more believable. It becomes another theory that people say, well, who knows? Maybe it is true. And that ultimately is where disinformation and misinformation is the most potent. It doesn't really need to convert people into believing something. All it needs to do to be effective is to make people doubt and question. So yeah, that's one example. And I think one question that part of your question was like, what can be done? Well, I think, obviously I think platforms have a lot of responsibility. I think both platforms and the media have a lot of responsibility. Platforms have been, interestingly, and I wonder whether others agree, better with the pandemic than they have been with the political disinformation that, the world has been struggling with. They have taken more measures, but, with Facebook, it's nowhere near enough. I mean, even with this 5G groups, what they're doing right now, they're playing a whack-a-mole game. They close one down, another one opens up, another one opens up, while, really in the and some of them get no attention at all. You know, we've noticed, for example, there is a new huge anti-5G group in Georgia, in the country, and Facebook just isn't paying attention to that, you know. So yeah, there could be definitely a lot more that is being done, and I think it's the platforms that have to be really, I mean, I'm very curious whether, you know, anyone from Facebook is attending this, but it's definitely their responsibility to be doing more.
Well, if there is anyone from Facebook tuning in, and I certainly hope there is, please do get in touch and let us know what is happening. Now, I'm now going to go to you, Martin, and it's interesting that we're all inside, and you're in Sweden, you're in Stockholm, and you're sitting outside. Now, the world press has pointed out many times that Sweden is taking a very different approach to the pandemic. There is no lockdown. Children are still at school. And if we're to believe what we read, it's very much business as usual in Sweden. You're living there. It's your daily life. Is it business as usual? Martin, I think you've muted yourself. If we could just get the sound back on.
Now.
Yeah, we have you now. There you go.
Yeah.
That's much better.
No, it's a myth that is business as usual. And before going into that myth, I think we need to stop and think of how Sweden has been used even before this pandemic as a case in a lot of, disinformation campaigns. During the refugee crisis in 2015, Sweden was used as this example described as it's a country on the brink of disaster, we have taken on too many refugees and so on. So it's been kind of a narrative of this bad Sweden, good Sweden, that's been used by both, local right-wing extremist groups, but also states and other actors, where Sweden is used as a kind of horror example to the world to show what kind of extreme liberalism could lead to. So I think we have to have that in mind when we are discussing kind of the media narrative about what Sweden is doing or not doing at the moment. But with that said, no, it's not business as usual. I'm sitting at one of the most popular cafes in my neighborhood, and today is Valborgisk night, so everyone is working half day and everyone is kind of free now. And it's totally empty behind me, and that is the case. Stockholm is not recognizable at all. Most people who can work from home are doing so. Schools are open up to grade 9, but above that, schools are closed, universities are closed. You have a lot of businesses going bankrupt, and there are severe consequences both for private persons, but also for companies and for the economy. But I think if you try to understand why Sweden has taken a different approach, I also think you have to look back at our country's history. We have had for the last 300-400 years a tradition of rather strong agencies or departments and rather small ministries. And I think that is also the reason that we have, the state epidemiologists, the researchers at the helm now, and not our prime minister. The daily press conferences is not conducted by ministers or the political level, but by researchers and experts. And there is also a huge trust among the Swedish population in these agencies. Due to a low level of corruption and so on, people think that the advice that they would come with are the best advices. And I think it also a sense in the society that this is a marathon. This is something that we will be coping with for, first weeks, months, but now we are talking years. And then you need to have a strategy that can cope with conducting a marathon. So it means putting a lot of responsibility on the different households to make decisions. And it can also sometimes be a misunderstanding when the Swedish authorities would recommend something that is usually, interpreted as, okay, we have to do this. We don't need a lockdown or police patrolling the streets to have that kind of effect in society. And there's also an opportunity for Sweden to, make sure that you can stay home if you are sick or if you have the slightest of symptoms by, a welfare system that makes that possible. But with that said, I think that we all, as journalists, we have to ask ourselves, okay, in this situation, what is our role? And at the end of the day, our role is not to be the mouthpiece of the government or just, if they say wash your hands, to tell our audience you need to wash your hands. That's not the role of journalism in this time. And that is one of the kind of dangerous things that I see, that more and more there is a rise of nationalism also among journalists, where you try to, defend your country's, the political decisions taken in your country in a way. And we don't have any European championship in football this year, so it's kind of the Corona battle has become the
default.
And there are a big discussion in Sweden now is there's so many people dying at the elderly care homes or the homes for elderly, and I think that will be the main discussion when this is over. How do we organize the homes for elderly people?
I think it's a very similar situation here in the UK as well. The exact numbers aren't known of people who have died either in their own home or who have died in care homes. So those numbers are filtering through slowly, but it's very much a similar situation. But thank you for filling us in on what the situation really is in Sweden. Thank you for that, Martin. We're now going to go over to China just to see what's happening over there. And that's where I bring you in, Ray. Now, we know that China has been a producer of disinformation. It's been accused of downplaying the virus, of underreporting deaths, and of silencing whistleblowers. But it's also been a target of disinformation. And China is now going to need to somehow manage its global reputation, its global image. How much of a priority will this be, Ray? What do you see them doing, and how do you see this playing out?
Sure. So when I look at the Chinese media landscape and how the government controls, manages, and manicures that landscape, one thing to keep in mind is that everything really starts domestically. The reason for that is that China's government has the most control over domestic media spaces and discourse. So as you just said, this has encompassed arresting and disincentivizing critical reporting and speech. You've had reporters arrested for, picking quarrels and stirring up trouble. You've seen changes in China's cybersecurity laws over what can be discussed online and what conduct constitutes grounds for account removals and shutdowns from social media on WeChat and Weibo. And another main plank is the push of really heroism-centered positive energy propaganda. This happened later into China's COVID-19 crisis when cases were going down, and there was an opportunity for the Chinese government to try to steer the narrative back into waters that was more politically conductive and more politically safe for the reputation of the CCP. Having said that, because China's government has the most control over domestic media spaces, a lot of the information damage and a lot of the information costs were borne out domestically. And so when I say that China is also a victim of misinformation and disinformation, it's usually relates to what we can and cannot attribute to Chinese government actions. For example, the Chinese government cannot in lieu of governments in Europe, UK, US do emergency preparations. And we've seen in other governments like South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Thailand, Vietnam, and Nordic countries and Germany, they've had the same information as the US, but they've taken different preparations. And so when you have accusations that China somehow released information that uniquely caused preparation blinders for the US, that's not necessarily something that we can attribute back to the Chinese government, because as much as the Chinese government censored information initially, that doesn't absolve other states for preparing ahead of time and communicating the threat of COVID-19 to their respective constituencies.
Thank you, Ray. I'm just looking at the questions are coming in thick and fast now. We have one here which I'm going to give to you, Julie, if that's okay. And it's an anonymous attendee. We don't have a name, but thank you for your question anyway. It said, when the pandemic started, dozens of persons took it upon themselves to share data, dashboards, graphs of COVID-19, many times misrepresenting or giving misleading data. And this is people not associated with the health industry. And the question is, could the excess of information be considered counterproductive? And which category would this fall into? Would it be misinformation, disinformation, or malinformation?
So a few things. I just want to come back before answering that question to something that I meant to say before at the beginning of the conversation. And that is the term fake news is of itself a problematic term. And we can unpack that a bit further later. But I think it's important to point out that that term has been absolutely weaponized by political actors who we now know, both from research and from, frankly, daily exposure to certain political briefings, that disinformation can come from the top down, and it can be fatal as well if it's circulated and taken as fact. So I just wanted to make that point up front. I think that's a really valid question, and it gets to one of the observable phenomena of the social media environment that we operate in now. The ecosystem is completely changed compared to the pandemic of 100 years ago during the Spanish flu. And we have two things to note about that. One is that everybody is an expert. People feel somehow feel an obligation or a responsibility to share all and every piece of information they find and to commentate on it. I would not say that putting data, if it's an accurate and reliable data set, into the public sphere for people to be able to investigate and interrogate is a bad thing at all. I think we have to actually think about access to information as an empowering defense against disinformation. The problem comes though when there are false data sets, which is certainly an aspect of the disinfodemic that we've identified in these UNESCO publications. We see data being both misunderstood and shared with good intention in the misinformation category, but also data that's being manipulated for, say, for example, political gain. And that data becomes a tool of the disinfodemic when it's misrepresented and manipulated, as it can be. So I think, part of our responsibilities as journalists and as those of us who are editors or publishers with news organizations of all sorts have an absolute responsibility to ensure that we are doing the due diligence of data interrogation and assessment and providing verified but also accessible ways to understand the masses of data that are out there. I think it's also really important to note that one of the problems with the weaponization of this term fake news is that politicians have used it to target journalists and citizens trying to actually fulfill a task of responsible sharing of this kind of information. And some of these data sets are used to do exactly what Martin suggested they should be used to do, which is to really robustly push back against certain political narratives to ensure that we hold governments to account if they are presenting information on the basis of their interpretation that serves them, whether it's about the rate of deaths, excluding nursing home deaths, for example, or related to debates about herd immunity and what the implications would be for the vulnerable. But one of the problems is that these government responses include legislating to try to restrict people's access to information or to limit the capacity of journalists to do their jobs. And we can come back and talk about this a bit more, but they fall in the category of these so-called fake news laws, where it's a sort of process of criminalizing the research and investigation that's done, sometimes in connection with data sets, often in connection with official information disseminated by governments.
Julie, you touched on the UNESCO handbook that you wrote along with UNESCO. It outlines methods of fact-checking, social media verification, and understanding malinformation, and why trust is imperative between journalists and the public. And I know it's been used as a training resource by journalists all over the world. Tell me how journalists are responding to this handbook.
Sure. So there's actually two separate pieces of work that we've done with UNESCO, and that's because that's the UN agency that focuses most on freedom of expression and media literacy. So the disinfodemic research that I'm talking about was just published last week. That actually identifies 9 key types of disinformation in terms of the themes connected to the coronavirus, 4 different format types. One of them is actually related to data sets, and also 10 different ways that organizations, governments, civil society outlets are responding to this crisis in terms of the methods that they're using. Then there is a handbook called Journalism Fake News, which is crossed out to problematize that term, and Disinformation, which was published a couple of years ago now by UNESCO, and is in fact in 20 languages and being used all around the world in journalism schools, as you indicate, but also in newsrooms and in various training settings. So the ways in which journalists are responding to the challenges of disinformation include some of the incredible work that people like Natalia are doing, which is to apply investigative journalism techniques to the theme of disinformation. And Natalia might want to speak about this too, but that's really putting journalists not just on the front line of combating disinformation as combatants or defendants in that space, to ensure that people can understand who are the disinformation agents and how this information is proliferating, and what they can do to actually understand and counter this flood of mis and disinformation. But it also, in so doing, puts journalists on the front line of the targeting of people who are combating disinformation. So journalists find themselves in 2 roles, both as combatants in the sense of trying to unmask the agents, fact checkers in the case of Tom's organization and many others, interrogate the data and explaining to their audiences what is actually going on. But also they become targets for abuse, harassment, digital security attacks by the orchestrated disinformation agents who are seeking to really counter that work that they're doing, but also to expose them to increased risk. So I just wanted to flag that there are both functions that are about investigating and revealing that are utterly essential to our ability to counter this disinfodemic, but also journalists are finding themselves increasingly targeted for harassment and abuse and other forms of digital violence. And many times we're seeing this in the context of coronavirus. Women are exposed more significantly, and particularly people of color. We've seen some horrendous attacks and escalations in reference to people of Asian background because of the disinformation associated with the origins of COVID-19. But investigative work, collaborative work, network analysis and big data analysis, network mapping, these are the sorts of techniques that are applied by organizations like Rappler in the Philippines, which really very early on, that outfit run by one of the world's most prominent and respected journalists, Maria Ressa, who has found herself targeted with the prospect of 80 years in prison, partly because of investigative work that was done on disinformation in the Philippines, political disinformation.
I'm just looking at the questions here. Thank you for that, Julie. And the questions are coming in, so thank you to our audience. Please keep them coming in. I'm going to direct this one to you, Martin, because it's about Africa. It says, hello, this is Caroline from Foundation Hirondelle. Any input on the panel, read the situation in Africa, the massive amount of lies, rumors, all at the same time, lack of reliable information, particularly on the statistics, how to counter rumors and provide African journalists with reliable data. Martin.
I mean, one takeaway that I see already, I mean, in Sweden, but also talking to colleagues in different African countries, is kind of the search among the public for traditional quality media. That's where people go now to get information, and everyone is really, you know, looking for credible, fact-checked information, and I mean, journalism. So, I mean, and I think it's easy not to forget that as we move on, also beyond this pandemic, that when we had this deadly virus arriving, what many people did was look for credible news, and really the role of journalism and journalists has never been more important. I mean, in terms of also life and death, saving advice and publications. I mean, one big problem it's a problem in Europe, but Africa even so more, is of course the testing capabilities is much lower. But I also say that there are other things that makes many of the countries in Africa more prepared, is that they had experiences of Ebola in near time. They have experiences of handling deadly diseases even before this virus erupted. And also you have, if you look at the age composition of many African states, you have a medium age which is very low compared to Europe. And I think that will also be significant and something to study and to look for. But of course, then you have a lot of, you know, authoritarian regimes, which figures you have to question. And I think that the problem now is that there's just too few boots on the ground being able to do, you know, quality reporting. And we are all, I mean, we have official press conferences to attend, and those press conferences take, I say, too much of our time instead of trying to get our boots on the ground and see what consequences this pandemic has on civilians in different countries. But that is, I mean, difficult to do today, but we need to find ways to do that.
Good question from Caroline. Thank you for that question. Thank you for answering that, Martin. I'd now like to go to Natalia. Natalia, President Trump announced that he was going to cut funding to the World Health Organization because, and I quote, he said they were responsible for so much death. Now, we know that this has caused a wild reaction around the globe. Some top analysts believe that since the United States benefits from the World Health Organization in pandemic control and public health regulations, that perhaps the president spoke, it was an unguarded statement. He wasn't really thinking, and it's nothing to be taken seriously. So two very different narratives there. Which one do you think is the most likely? Natalia. Do we still have Natalia?
Yes, her mic's off.
Sorry about that. Sorry. You know, I'm not sure I understand the question. Is the question for me to say who is right, Trump or WHO? That's a very difficult question to answer, because I'm sure there are legitimate questions about WHO in this crisis, which personally I feel like I don't have an answers to. You know, I also have questions that I don't quite understand some of the role of WHO. I mean, obviously Trump has been so destructive throughout the crisis, and I think everyone kind of, here we are at an event called the webinar called Infodemic. I mean, he is the commander-in-chief at the moment, right? He is leading the wave. I mean, we can be just straight about it. So I don't have an answer to that, quite simply. I mean, I don't, but it is another really good sign, kind of clear sign of like how quickly the situation can become confusing. And on the list of questions, I'm just seeing a really interesting question from Brazil. And it's a question about, says, we have a president who spreads disinformation. Just yesterday, he posted on Twitter saying that WHO encourages masturbation and homosexuality of children. And what's fascinating about that, I mean, again, Bolsonaro has not been far from Donald Trump. Incredible statements and incredible sort of pieces of disinformation. And sometimes I think it's helpful to call things what they are, which they're lies. But with this particular piece that he tweeted, and I haven't seen it myself, about the linking masturbation and homosexuality to WHO. I mean, sounds completely mad, right? We did a story 2.5 years ago about kind of some of the most common myths that are spread by Russian state television and Russian media. And this is one of them. WHO encourages masturbation and homosexuality of children, and we should be against the WHO. And to see it come back, and this is actually really interesting because we've seen this trend elsewhere. For example, this kind of the alliances of certain narratives are becoming clearer in this crisis. For example, just today, we spotted that for years now, Russia has been very outspoken about the U.S. bio labs in the Russia, kind of in Russia's backyard, right? In the former Soviet Union, there are several. There is one in Kazakhstan, there is one in Georgia, and they have been a target of a very consistent campaign from the Russians, both state media as well as the government. And like every time there is any sort of an outbreak, we hear that the Lugar lab in Georgia is responsible for fill in the blank, Ebola, SARS, swine flu, everything. So we heard that again with coronavirus. They have been fake news stories, the stories circulating, saying that these US labs are involved. What we saw today is that the Chinese state media and the Iranian state media are now putting out the same story, and that has never happened before. And this is in some ways, a kind of a natural alignment of narratives, but I think it's also somewhat organized alignment of narratives as well, because we know that Russia, for example, has really made a point of doing a media training, like Sputnik, the Russian big state news agency, sends out journalists to other countries like the Philippines, and across the world, really, Venezuela. And the Iranian have long used the Russian propaganda networks, the Russian state television networks, in order to sort of trying to build something similar to RT, which they haven't succeeded at for various reasons, partially because it's much more chaotic and much less organized as an effort than the Russian has been. But this kind of like there is a natural like alignment, and it is interesting to see how in this pandemic these narratives are becoming more kind of unified, and because of that, I think stronger.
Thank you for that. That's a Excellent answer. Ray, if I could come to you now, going back to China. Now, we know that China is under state control when it comes to what news sites and what websites people have access to. They also have the added level of the cyber police who monitor the online activity of its 1.4 billion citizens. Now, we saw what has been called the whistleblower doctor, who was the Chinese doctor Li Wenliang. He was the doctor who first came out and said that it was a SARS-like virus and that we needed to be careful. He was told to be silent and stop spreading fake news. He sadly succumbed to the virus and has died. And very unusual for China, there was a real outpouring on social media about this doctor. Tell me about that outpouring and what the reaction of Beijing was.
Okay, so whenever people ask about Dr. Li Wenliang, what really I want to emphasize is he is not the traditional sort of person that you would think China censors. When we typically think about who China censors, you think, you know, dissidents like, you know, Ai Weiwei, or people that are associated with the 1989 Tiananmen protests. But Li Wenliang, before COVID-19, he was just in a sort of average eye doctor working in a hospital in Wuhan. He was a party member. He was very, very rank and file. When he went he didn't even go to the general public with his information. When we think about his whistleblower activity, he posted it in a private group chat of medical school alumni from his university. And what really set people off was not only the fact that he was disciplined, but the fact that he had to sign a confession saying that he would not spread rumors further. And this branding of sort of information that, you know, people may have thought wasn't political before as, you know, politically sensitive rumors, that was what I think made a lot of people angry in the aftermath of his death, because this was a factor that endangered their safety. Fast forward to today, and the Chinese government has sort of co-opted and utilized its resources to really sort of reshape how it relates to Li Wenliang. They've sort of, you know, branded him as a sort of martyr for the cause of, you know, fighting COVID-19 within China. China, by the way, has anti-defamation laws related to martyrs. So now this sort of loops him into a group of people who, you know, if you say certain things about them that's unauthorized, that makes that speech subject to censorship. So how
does that mean that history has been rewritten almost?
It has literally been rewritten, because within China, there's actually been a rollout of an official narrative of how China's handled COVID-19. And obviously it's written, because it's written by Chinese state authors, it is written in a way that is very favorable and politically safe for Xi Jinping and the CCP.
And the fact that people took to social media in China, which is unusual to go against Beijing. What does this tell us about the situation?
It tells us that, as I just mentioned, if there's something that the state is doing that really endangers people in a concrete way, such as withholding, you know, health information, this is something that gets people really upset. However, we also had a lot of people saying, oh, you know, this is going to introduce large fissures in how, you know, China's political system withstands this in the longer term. Unfortunately, this is not the first time that a natural disaster or pandemic has been hurled in the direction of the CCP. In 2008, there was a massive earthquake in Sichuan, but the playbook for the CCP is to try to really lock down discourse that I think is politically unsafe for them in the medium to long term, and then establish and really, really hammer home the official narrative. And I think given that we're now in the medium term of COVID-19 within China, that is what is happening, and that's what they're choosing to spend their resources on.
Thank you, Ray. We're going to now take another question from our audience. And Tom, I'm going to direct this one to you. So if you could unmute yourself, I can see that you're muted there. This question is, what is the target of fake narratives during the outbreak of coronavirus? Are there any particular characteristics, age, education, male, female?
I've no idea. So it's really important to say, so from our perspective, as a fact-checking organization, we look less at who's being targeted or where it's originating from. Like, our concern is actually that bit in the middle of the actual information itself. So we have probably less insight into this than maybe some of the other panelists would do, because we're focusing on the facts rather than who's spreading it or who's believing it. But I would say that more generally, it does seem to be quite broad. These are areas that we're going to look into more, is sort of whether or not there are particular problems in maybe certain communities or things like that. But it does seem to be fairly broad, and it does seem to, a lot of it seem to be fairly organic. It is the kind of thing, the misinformation we're seeing is the kind of thing that you do see during health crises, and you have done, frankly, since long before the rise of social media. I mean, you can go back centuries even and see sort of similar tropes emerging during health crises previously. Sort of go back to sort of well poisoning panics in sort of medieval Europe, and you can see sort of these same fears of sort of contamination, of blaming it on outsiders, and this the way that these rumors traveled and sort of became these zombie claims that wouldn't go away. And so you can kind of see this. You can see it in sort of the cholera riots and plague riots have been sort of seen in many countries around the world through many different centuries. So this sort of the fear of contamination is one of the really core sort of emotive drivers of an awful lot of misinformation, even outside of health crises. Sort of fears that sort of that a particular food stuff has been contaminated, or that there is some sort of disease going around from a certain group of people or something like that, is sort of a really strong driver of sort of false rumor in the best of times. So it's hardly surprising that it happens as well during an actual pandemic.
Good answer. Thank you for that, Tom. We have another question here coming in from Sabin Mustafa, and he says technology itself is playing a huge role by creating algorithms of bias as well as fake news to further political and financial gains. How can digital journalists and entities counter that? Who would like to take that? Anybody feel qualified to give that one a go? How about you, Julie?
Yeah, so who was that one from? I'm just rereading the question.
It was from Sabin Mustafa.
Okay, yes, so technology is playing a huge role, and algorithmic bias is a significant part of that. I think there's two problems here. One is that we are dependent on the internet communications companies for distributing much of our quality information, whether that's professional journalism that is independent and rigorous, or official public health information that is issued in the interests of ensuring we are safe. Now, just to pick up on something that was said earlier by Natalia, I think, there has been a lot of consternation, debate and critique of the slowness of the so-called platforms to respond to political disinformation. What we have seen in reference to this crisis is a very swift response to a threat to human life on a pandemic scale. And there is now necessarily, particularly I think in reference to World Press Freedom Day, which is what we're talking about in the background here, a really significant opportunity to ensure that journalists hold the platforms to account as much as they're holding governments to account, and that they are demanding that quality, accurate information be able to be better surfaced, more visible, that there be better compensation for that kind of journalism, because the algorithmic base of so much social media sharing is connected to, as somebody else said, the emotional responses rather than a discernment around facts. When we share things, it's usually because we're moved in one way or another to share them. And so it becomes vitally important that those partnerships that exist between news organizations, civil society, intergovernmental organizations and governments and the platforms really emphasize the need for there to be better responses to disinformation, particularly of the political kind, particularly where journalists are being targeted. So you're not just neutralizing through algorithmic methods the reliable content or downplaying it because you're effectively enabling the dissemination at speed and with more visibility of disinformation, but you're also silencing the journalists to an extent. There's another risk associated with that, which is censorship, and so it's a very difficult challenge to deal with. But I think it's really important to underline the need to deal with this in reference to international human rights law, that which is all about ensuring access to reliable information and ensuring freedom of expression is protected, but within the boundaries of other human rights, such as privacy, for example. So with regard to digital journalism and the ways in which that might be useful as a response to the problems we have with the algorithmic curation on the social platforms, where advertising has diminished, and now we're seeing the pandemic just kill off whole news organizations and publications. Ways in which you can use digital journalism to try to develop relationships with your audiences, to enable the capacity for greater trust in your content. I mean, coupled with that is, of course, a commitment to quality reporting, that ensures that you are able to defend yourself against ridiculous claims that because you are critical of a president, you must be fake news, for example. So I think it's got to do with a combination of innovative responses to storytelling and engagement that do enable the connection of loyal audience members with a news organization and the journalists. And there's many ways in which that's happening, but also it involves a form of accountability journalism that needs to be, even if you're receiving funding from the platforms, critical of the platforms where required.
Thank you, Julie. Martin, that leads me nicely into you. Julie spoke there about silencing journalists. Now, you know only too well how dangerous it can be to be a journalist. As we said earlier, you were sentenced to 11 years for covering a story in Ethiopia, and you had to spend 14 months behind bars. Do you think that the work of independent critical journalists is being hailed as fake news, so that corporate actors, politicians, governments don't have to accept responsibility so they can avoid accountability? In other words, what I'm saying is fake news being used as a weapon against independent critical journalists in this pandemic?
I mean, during this last hour, we heard many examples of that, the term fake news being weaponized, as Julia put it. And it is an increasing, problem. And I think that there is something to learn from this pandemic, and that could be useful, is that in order to solve this, I think we need to we learn to wash our hands now all over the world, and now we need to learn media literacy all over the world, and that puts a big task on us journalists to explain to the audience, how we work, how we from the first idea to the finished product. To open kind of the hoof to the motor and show this is journalism, this is a reportage, these are the ingredients in it. To separate, quality journalism from just, someone writing something or claiming something on the internet. And I think we need to take the opportunity and really be better at doing that, because that will lead to a public that will, defend journalists. And we also see that now with the crisis, the financial crisis for many news organizations really makes this pandemic even more dangerous. And I think that everyone who's listening or watching and who's not a journalist themselves, we need to, you know, what can we do to fight this virus? Yeah, we could pay for journalism. You know, we could subscribe to a newspaper, or we could support journalists that do work that we benefit from. And so it shows. I mean, as I said before, this crisis also shows the importance of journalism, and that's a hopeful part of it. Really, it's an opportunity for quality journalism to, you know, straighten your backs and to be proud of the work that we are doing. And we can also see that in numbers of readers and listeners of viewers in traditional quality journalism. They are, I mean, increasing all over the world, and that is an opportunity. And it's just, I mean, the situation is too severe to only be solved by, I mean, journalists can fight for other journalists, but it's just not enough. Or, you know, NGOs and organizations working for journalists, but it's not enough. We need to, you know, engage the whole community in a way, and that we can see that being done now with the coronavirus and the response to coronavirus. And I think there's a lot to learn from that when we continue to work also on other topics.
Thank you for that, Martin. Natalia, we've just had one come in on an email for you. Russia now has nuclear, biological and chemical personnel stationed in Bergamo, which we know is the epicenter of the outbreak in Italy. This would have been unthinkable before the pandemic. What do we think will happen going forward once the virus is under control? Do we think that Russia will simply leave, or could it be, as some experts predict, a way to undermine NATO and the EU? Big question there. Natalia.
Obviously, no one knows, no one has an answer to what will happen when the pandemic ends, but I am pretty sure, I think it's a rare occasion when I can speak with certainty. I think if Russia can stay, they will stay, because you know, the Kremlin is very opportunistic and very clever and smart on jumping, you know, filling the vacuums and jumping on opportunities. So if the if the European Union allows that opening, allows that opportunity, they will. Well, it's pretty safe to say they will exploit it, because that's what they are genuinely very good at. And the fact that the Russian troops are stationed in Bergamo is one of the many illustrations of it, I would say. So we did the story about the Russians in Bergamo together with La Stampa. We investigated who they were and what they were doing. And of course, you know, it was an incredible example of sort of political disinformation and manipulation, and kind of a country hopping on an opportunity. Russia sent a plane full of not one plane, pardon me, 16 planes, I think in the end it was, massive military jets to Italy with humanitarian aid. And then it turned out that the humanitarian aid was brought by about 120 high-ranking officers from the very secretive unit of the Russian military that is linked to the Russian military intelligence, the JRU. So you know, things did not add up. It especially didn't make sense, considering the fact that Italy, in fact, has one of the best similar units within NATO is Italy. So Italy has the capability to do the decontamination work that the Russians said they would be doing. So there were serious it caused a political scandal. Our reporting with La Stampa caused some political scandal in Italy. And La Stampa, it was incredible to see, speaking of pressure on journalists, it was amazing to see how quickly the La Stampa reporter became the target of the Russian campaign. The La Stampa was brought up again and again in the press briefings by the foreign ministry, but then there was after the story, one of the last story came out, there was an incredible post on the official Facebook page of the Ministry of Defense of Russia that said, "He who digs his grave will fall into it," referring to La Stampa reporting. And if you just think about it, you know, this is a Russian Ministry of Defense basically threatening a European journalist from a NATO country. So there was more to it, and it caused a scandal and so on. But, you know, ultimately, yes, it was, you know, and it was an operation which many suspect was a, you know, kind of an intelligence gathering slash PR operation to show that the Russian troops, incredible pictures of the Russian boots on the ground, you know, in next to one of the biggest NATO military bases, all lost in that panic and crisis and genuine need for help. And of course, Russian media, you know, went, you know, had a party with the pictures, using the pictures of and video of, you know, some genuinely very grateful Italians who were sort of saying thank you to Vladimir Putin. You know, so it's kind of the many sort of elements of a soft power slash propaganda operation that we saw on display in Italy. Actually, another Italian paper, Repubblica, then did a story. They found evidence that a lot of that Italians were being paid to post, some Italians were being paid to post messages of gratitude to Russia on social media. And we saw same with the Chinese, you know, we saw the Chinese official accounts tweeting tweeting about sort of Italians being so grateful to China and so on. And of course, some people I think genuinely absolutely were, but in this situation, you know, these countries like China and Russia, although very different, but you know, with some similar authoritarian streaks, you know, they tend to be rather much more crude about kind of using and abusing that that reaction than.
I know that Putin has painted himself as a savior, having to step in and help out and save the day where the leaders of these countries somehow couldn't quite manage it. Has he succeeded in his desire to bolster his public opinion? Do people think of him as a savior?
Well, I think it's very difficult to say. I mean, his ratings are high. They were falling, but they're still very high for, you know, for anyone. So it's the kind of a ratings any politician in the West would kill for. And, you know, there are many reasons why he is still a genuinely popular president. I think right now, you know, if 2 weeks ago we very much saw a kind of total slamming of the West and sort of saying, the Russian state media saying, look, you know, this is finally here, we have a proof of how dysfunctional West is, and they had pictures to support that, you know. You know, today Russia is very much kind of refocusing on the outbreak within Russia, because things are bad. You know, I think they hit 100,000 cases today with around 1,000 deaths, and they're rising. So, and the crisis is real. And when you get the sort of the additional kind of story with the Saudi and Russia and oil prices and the economy, you know, these are difficult times for everyone, including the politicians who are also trying to profit from them. So you know, I don't think there is kind of a singular answer to them. Is Putin, has it worked? Is Putin popular? We don't know like what kind of world will emerge from this story, but Putin is doing what he you know, what he always do. He's running Russia the way he's always ran it, and he's also using the crisis as an opportunity to show how dysfunctional the West is. And in that way, the West has always helped him along, and to strengthen its geopolitical positions, often by using lies and disinformation.
Now we're almost running out of time, so just a few quick questions, right? If I could have a quick in the West, we're used to the rhetoric between the Trump administration and the Xi administration. First, we had the trade wars, then we had the tariffs, now we have COVID-19. Will they ever be able to stop playing the blame game and work together? Do you see that ever happening?
In short, not for the foreseeable future. A lot of these tensions have sort of undergirded the current debate over COVID-19, but the sort of shaky politics between the two administrations have not really been on solid footing, and US-China geostrategic competition has, I think, sort of many arenas in which the two states have clashed. This is just one of them.
And Tom, I'd like to just end with you, please. What responsibility do we as citizens have to make sure that we get our news from independent, critical, trustworthy sources, and that we don't add to the problem by sharing and resharing posts that we may think are questionable? What kind of accountability and responsibility do we have as citizens?
Yeah, so as I've said before, like, it's really understandable. I think we need to approach this from a place of like empathy and understanding. It is really understandable that in a confusing and scary time, people's sense of what is plausible and what is implausible could go away. But yes, we do all have a part to play in this. In the short term, in the immediate time, then yes, it is just taking a moment, as Martin sort of said earlier. We've all learned to wash our hands properly, and I think there's a kind of similar thing that you can do to sort of flatten the curve of misinformation. Sort of that same 20 seconds that you're going to take to wash your hands and sing happy birthday twice or whatever song it is that you choose to do. That same sort of little pause before you share a piece of information really can help. And so we've written a sort of guide to how you can do that yourself, like the little sort of early stage checks that, sort of professional journalists, professional fact checkers like us will do. Those aren't like sort of complex skills or like sort of weird magic we do. Like, those are really simple things. And so, like, I think that's the kind of sort of territory where in the short term we can all do it. And in the longer term, then I think this has really brought home, this crisis, the importance of good information. And so there's the response on one side is to sort of flatten the spread of bad information, but that on its own won't do the job. You need to have good information in its place, because otherwise just more, you can play whack-a-mole forever, but in the absence of good information, more bad information will just flow into that void. And so I think it is on all of us. It's on the public, it's on the media industry, it's on government, it's on businesses, to all play a little role that we have here to encourage and uplift good information. Whether or not that's governments actually putting out that good information and being more proactive on that. We saw with, the concerns around 5G is, we've been talking about that for over a year now. We warned last summer that there wasn't enough good official guidance that actually properly addressed these fears rather than just dismissing them out of hand. Now, of course, we're in a situation where it's too late to build that trust. And so that's what, it's always a good idea to get out that good information, that reliable information earlier on, before a crisis hits. So yeah, there's something that we can all do. And yeah, I think that sort of sense, we sort of talk about media literacy and all that sort of thing. And we need to, everybody needs to sort of be better at media literacy, but also I think we in the media need to have a better understanding of the public's media literacy. Like, very often we talk about things that, you just, everybody knows, the journalist doesn't write the headline, that's written by the sub-editor, of course that's not even true anymore. Like, lots of journalists write their own headlines because there aren't any sub-editors being employed by lots of outlets. But I think we also need to understand that, like, some of the problem is not like a lack of media literacy. It is in fact a problem of media literacy as well. Like, there is a lot of understanding of the biases that media itself can have. And that is, that's not a situation where more media literacy necessarily helps. And so we actually need to sort of respond to the levels of media literacy that are out there and all work to sort of build that trust by being open, by being transparent, by correcting mistakes, by sort of doing the things that I think Martin was talking about, like showing what good reporting actually looks like. And so, this isn't going to be a quick fix on anybody's part, but yeah, there is a role that all of us, I think, can play.
Thank you for that, Tom. Well, as we've just heard from our expert panel, misinformation, conspiracy theories, social media, PR exercises, propaganda machines are all fueling the epidemic of misinformation surrounding COVID-19. The antidote, as we've heard, to misinformation is transparency, clear, honest, and concise information, with countries working together and not point scoring and working against each other. It's also up to us, as Tom said, the general public, to check the facts and not to believe everything that we read. We have to take some accountability too. Please check out the websites, the social media feeds of all my guests here today. Will certainly point you in the right direction, and we'll make sure their details are below. I'd like to thank my guests, Tom Phillips, Natalia Antelava, Rui Zhong, Dr. Julie Posetti, and Martin Schibbye. And I'd like to thank you for joining us from all over the world. We really appreciate you joining us today. I'd also like to thank IOHR and ICFJ for putting this webinar together. And as I said, we will do our best to answer as many of those questions that we didn't get around to today as we possibly can. For myself, TRISH LYNCH, stay safe, and we hope to do more of these webinars, and please do keep your feedback coming in. So for myself and my wonderful guests, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Bye-bye.